Hi, welcome to Guitar Talk. We're a little hostless today. My name is Stan Biankiewicz. I'm filling in for not only the host, but also the guest. The host is normally Matt Cogswell, who is having a little bit of car troubles today. Today's episode on Guitar Talk is we're going to talk about other instruments in the guitar family. The one that's most commonly used is the bass guitar. There is also the tenor guitar. And there's also another guitar called the octave guitar, which down the line we'll be discussing those too. We're going to start with the history of the bass guitar and how it all came about. And what ended up happening was, I'm going to put this down and shut it off so it doesn't make any noise. And it all started with this pick. This pick belonged to a gentleman named Nick Lucas. Nick Lucas was a singer and a guitar player extraordinaire in the 20s. And Nick was before what we consider swing music, and before swing music, I call it boom chick, but it's reminiscent of Louis Prima. Louis Prima was always in that kind of a mode, that pre-swing rhythm. And before Louis, well, actually, Louis wasn't, I think, born yet, or just got born. There was a gentleman named Nick Lucas. His books on guitar went all the way through World War II into the 50s. His hits, one of the most famous was Tiptoe Through the Tulips, which those of you with a little age behind you will remember. Tiny Tim did remakes of Tin Pan Alley, which Nick came from. And what Nick was doing is he was a singer in front of a big band. And at the time, big band was forming from Dixieland jazz. So the people who were playing the rhythm parts in Dixieland jazz were not guitar players, but they were banjo players. And the people who played bass for Dixieland jazz were not upright bass viol players, they were instead tuba players. Well, when we record instruments, just like when you see an orchestra get laid out, you'll notice that the weaker instruments are in the front and the stronger instruments are in the back. Now Nick, the designer of this shape pick, I'll talk to you about that in a quick second, he said, you know, I play guitar and I can't stand the banjo. Why don't you record me with my guitar in the front? And the tuba, because the tuba was also in the back of the band, the tuba and the banjo was sometimes what they call spike the recording, distort the recording by getting a little bit too much volume into it. So he said, why don't we get an upright bass viol and have them sit with me in the front of the band when we record it. And when people heard the bass viol in Nick's recordings, they said, that's the instrument for big band. Tuba, no more. Upright bass. Well, now the little bands from the Midwest and the industry started getting bigger. When we first started playing steel string instruments, we played them with our fingernails, which is why I point out the shape. Everybody had a shape that they liked to make their pick in to, and this was Nick Lucas's shape, the guy who brought not only guitar into the big band, but also, in my mind, brought bass into the big band. Everybody started using upright basses. And what occurred after World War II is everybody was going to start designing electric instruments. And hollow instruments would feed back, and the upright bass being a huge hollow instrument. A lot of times when you heard the bands play live, you never heard the bass player because the horns would drown them out completely. And even with the amplification, you could only go so far because the instrument would start to squeal and feed back. So this company called Ampeg after World War II designed an upright plastic bass, and they were known for bass amplification, voila the name Ampeg. What they would do is they'd put the transducer, the microphone. Transducer is a microphone that picks up on vibrations. It usually is made from piezo crystal. And they stuffed it at the end of the peg that you would shove underneath the bass and have it stand on its foot. Unlike the bass that the upright electric that I have behind me that does not feed back at all. I can get this as loud as I want and still sound like an upright bass player. But this came down the line, way down the line, because they didn't realize that solid instruments would stop feeding back. Oh, they're going to get a beautiful shot of it. Isn't she beautiful? This is a manufacturer, I don't believe they're still in business, called Kid. And as you're going into the next bass, that's a new design. That's a Steinberger design. Actually, both of these instruments are Ned Steinberger designs. Excellent audio engineer when it comes to, and luthier when it comes to making electric instruments and getting different frequencies and sounds. Anyway, but let's go back to the story. So this came about as the band started growing in numbers. Fewer and fewer upright bass players were to be found. Reason being, it was a very expensive instrument. So if there were 15 bass players in a 200-mile radius, 5 would be doctors and lawyers that wouldn't want to go on the road with a honky-tonk band or rock and roll or country swing, whatever. These people had occupations. The next 5 players in that 200-mile radius would be people that worked for the Philharmonic. They need more than one upright bass player in that Philharmonic, and there's that 5. And then the last 5, I hate to tell you the story this way, but you basically search the alleyways, find out where they are, find out where they hawk their bass, sober them up, and then get them back on the road with you. So people started doing things with electric guitars. One, they started finding out that hollow instruments fed back, and they started making solid guitars. And what guitar players would do was one of them would become the bass player by muting the strings, and Paul McCartney wasn't the first to do this. And this was in replacement of not being able to find an upright bass player, have the guitar player play the bass line. Well, at that point, the guitar builders said, well, why don't we make a bass guitar? That sounds like an upright. Of course, they weren't successful at it, but they tried. Leo Fender came out with a model called the Precision Bass. He called it the Precision Bass because it had frets. Any guitar player could play the last 4 strings. They're the same as a guitar. They just had to learn the job, and now they had a bass. They would put what they call flat wound strings on it because that's what uprights would have. And then if you looked at the hardware on the instruments, if you looked at, for instance, a Rickenbacker or even a Music Man in the 70s, they would have what they call bass mutes that were adjustable and would be mimicking the sound of the palm of your hand resting on the string to get that kind of thud sound. In the covers of Fenders, if you notice, there was one on a jazz bass. There was one cover and another cover on the bridge, and then on the same thing on the P bass. But if you looked at the differences between the two, there was well, let me pick this up. There was a metal cover over here, and that was because single coils would hum. And that was more what they call noise reduction. Shielding is what the term that's used in the business. And then over here was a small one on a P bass and a real big one on the jazz bass. Reason being, the jazz bass had a second pickup and needed shielding too. So the reason the big piece of metal is on the jazz bass is it's also covering the back pickup to help with noise reduction. And underneath there, where the bridge was, they lay a piece of neoprene, which is what they make wetsuits out of, and they adhesive it to the inside of the metal, so when you put it down, it would give you this kind of sound. I can't, well, you have to kind of play it with a pick in order to do that. And the flat wound strings would give you more of that deeper resonance that was more customary with the upright bass. Oops, let's shut the noise off. And they said to Leo, they said, you made it too long. And Leo said, well, No, I'm tired of hearing the bass mumble. I want to hear the clarity. I want to hear it go boom, boom, boom. Clarity in musical instruments is enunciation. So if you don't have the clarity in the instrument, you're going to mumble. And then it's a mid-range instrument, so if you're looking for more clarity on a bass guitar, crank the mids. Might not sound as bassy, but that's what Jack Bruce did in order to be heard back in the day with the band Cream. Gibson made shorter scale basses, and the shorter the scale, the muddier and darker they became. And this seemed to be where bass was wandering in the 50s. Rickenbacker basses were similar to Fender basses, for the exception of they were neck through instead of bolt on, instead of two pieces. So as you can see with this bass, you'll notice that there's screws back here and the neck is bolted on, and you can see from this side a little better than you can from the other. You can see the actual end of the neck here. Rickenbackers were made to a similar scale length as the Fenders. Now you go, jeepers, why would Rickenbacker follow Fender when Gibson was making basses that sounded more like upright basses but were bass guitars and muddy and thuddy and not clear? Well, Rickenbacker, Adolf Rickenbacker himself, was selling Rickenbacker guitars. F.C. Hall, who purchased Rickenbacker guitars, owned a place called Radio-Tel. And in the early years of Radio-Tel, well, actually in the early years of Fender Musical Instruments, Radio-Tel was the first distributor of Fender Musical Instruments. And when Fender sales developed, they stole the general manager of Radio-Tel, a gentleman named Don Randall, and they incorporated him into the new Fender Corporation, and he was now head of sales. Well, F.C. Hall was left out, and he didn't want to be left out. So he bought Adolf Rickenbacker out and created Rickenbacker Instruments, and a lot of them used the same ideas and engineering that Leo Fender had in mind with the use of maple. This bass right here is a G&L, which is the last company that Leo Fender owned. And because of clarity reasons, this bass body is not made of alder or swamp ash or hard ash. The reason Fender went with hard ash in the 70s was for even more clarity. This body's made out of maple, which is the clearest, brightest wood available to mankind. And they put a yellow finish on it. No, it's actually, this actually is a white finish, and due to aging, this is a 1979, nitrocelluloid lacquer, like oil-based poly, will yellow. And if you look at the corner, if I can see that, that's actually what the color of the instrument was when I bought it way back when. In the late 50s, because bass guitar was kind of whining and not really doing well in sales, a thing happened in the music industry. It was called tic-tac bass, and it involved an instrument that I don't have with me today. It involved the baritone guitar, and sometimes they would tune it more towards the bass guitar and use it more like a secondary bass guitar. But the baritone had a lot of clarity, and it was, usually tuned a little higher. Instead of being tuned an octave below, it was tuned down to B, a B to B type of tuning, as opposed to an E to E type of tuning. These baritones were 6-string instruments. You would heard them a lot in the late 50s and early 60s. A lot of spaghetti westerns and even TV shows incorporated the baritone guitar as opposed to the regular guitar for the solos. They have that deep, mid-rangey richness about them. They take them, and the guitar player would play the bass line with the upright bass player. And this is before sampling was invented due to the digital age. And what it is it takes the envelope, and an envelope is It comes out, looks like the Rock of Gibraltar, comes up to a peak and then drops and then comes slowly down. So this first abrupt line is the attack of the envelope, which now was the baritone guitar, not the attack of the bass. The baritone wouldn't sustain as much as the bass, so the sustain line came from the bass. And then one day a cheap producer came in and said, wait a minute, can't we make a Fender bass sound like that? Do we need to hire the guitar player twice? They didn't want to hear that. They just wanted to hire the guitar player once. So Fender basses were now what was going to be used. They had the clarity, the other basses really didn't. When I was a recording engineer in Los Angeles in the 70s, it was still, electric bass was still referred to as Fender bass. So if you were recording someone, there's a piece of tape that goes over all the channels so the engineer knows which channel's which. If it was an upright bass, that channel would be listed as bass. If it was an electric bass, it wouldn't say electric, it would say Fender bass, regardless of what electric bass you were playing in the studio. For more clarity, a gentleman in Britain came up with a round wound bass string as opposed to a flat wound for more clarity. And to boost the clarity even more, they came up with a steel wrap to get that extra clarity. So that's when guitar players asked for the steel wrap, and they found out it feels grisly, and the steel wrap strings, for some people, the acetone in their sweat will kill the steel, take out the clarity. Some older players preferred the round wound string once it became dead and had a limited amount of clarity because it still had more clarity than the flat wound string, but the deadness gave more of a bass response and a more fullness to the equalization points. So a lot of old studio cats that used the round wounds in the 60s for the clarity preferred them to be more like a 6-month-old string. And this I know by having a conversation with an infamous bass player named Duck Dunn. He was with Stax Records back in the day, with Steve Cropper. Obviously, the Blues Brothers used the same team when they did the movie, and that was Steve Cropper on guitar and Duck Dunn on bass. And I ran into Duck in Los Angeles at a party of a friend at the time. Was a gentleman named Gary Marker, who was always referred to as Magic Marker, and he was buddies with Doug, with Donald, and what ended up happening was he had a party. Now Magic Marker was also the bass player for Captain Beefheart in the early days. Ry Cooder was at the party, the infamous slide guitar player, and I ran into Duck. He was just kind of sitting by himself, and I started yakking to him about, you know, what he uses for strings and this and that. And he said, I use roto sounds. And I said, gee, you know, I can't get more than 3 days out of the set before I'm boosting the clarity in my amplifier. And he goes, oh, I don't like them new. I like them old because they're brighter than a flat wound string, yet they have some reminiscent features of the flat wound when they get that old. And I go, gee, you know, the intonation goes on a string, and he kind of grinned and said, that's my fretless sound. So these strings came in and into prominence. Now, as the bass developed, because of clarity reasons, in the 70s, what did we see mostly? Bass players playing either Fender products or Rickenbacker products. Now, the Rick design was an alteration of the Fender. He used maple right from the get-go, didn't bother with the alder and the swamp ash that was being used on the Fender basses. They started off as swamp ash, and then by, I believe, 55 or 1956, because swamp ash has a lot of pores in it, it was a difficult wood to finish, they switched to alder. And most of the instruments were made out of alder all the way to the late 60s when they started making them out of hard ash, which is where the weight came in. So if anybody ever picks up a 70s Fender bass and it looks like an ash body, it's a hard ash body, which is a brighter wood than the swamp ash, but adds the weight. But once you get to that weight, Leo went, in some cases, to maple, whereas Rickenbacker started right off with maple, knowing that Gibson was compensating for their shorter scale length and loss of clarity by using maple in their guitars, and the basses were still being made out of mahogany from Gibson, and also at a shorter scale length. So again, they weren't as usable as the Fenders and the Rickenbackers. And as the 70s progressed, we had new designers come into play. This one that I'm going to show you here is a Ned Steinberger design. This is a Stewart Spectre. It's one of the old ones. Stewart actually made this bass by hand. I don't know what the heck it's worth these days, but this is my bass. And the model of this bass is the NS1, the one that you see mostly with Stewart Spectre, or NS2, 2 standing for 2 pickups. And it has the fancier inlay on the neck than this one does. As you can see, it's a very simple dot inlay. But this is a neck-through instrument. So what you're seeing here is the end of the neck. If we can focus at the very end, you can see. Now what he did was to make so he didn't have to make the neck as fat and not have as much lost wood. He layered a piece on the back where you can see the discoloration there where it moves into the next piece. Of course, you can see how smooth and easily accessible you can make this up. As far as getting up the end of the neck. Look, I don't have to go across or anything. I'm right up there. This design was, unfortunately, due to the fact that Stewart was pretty much in between. He had sold it to Kramer for a while, Stewart Spectre himself, and Ned Steinberger designed this for Stewart. But Ned was kind of busy with his graphite designs at the time to probably go along with Stewart. But if you notice, this looks very similar to a Warwick. Copyrights in the United States do not go worldwide, just like you can buy guitars that are made exactly like Fenders, exactly like other instruments in other countries. And they're, in many cases, just as good a quality, but there's no copyright infringement because they're not exporting them or importing them. In the late 70s, early 80s, the copy world went through a massive, well, actually it was the late 70s, went through lawsuits. And so now they can't export anything that's a copyright infringement. So the only people that can do that. But at any rate, Stewart didn't keep up on the copyright, and Warwick makes a very similar model, although it's, again, a combination of Rickenbacker neck-through. And why neck-through versus bolt-on? Well, just like guitars, neck-throughs sustain the best, but usually carry the least amount of attack. The notes go down and out, and then they come back in, and but because it's a neck-through, it flows back and forth. There's no interruption. A glue-on neck has interruption, but less interruption than a bolt-on neck. Back to this. So the bolt-ons actually come back and give you snap. That's why a lot of players prefer bolt-on necks to do that 80s popping and snapping stuff, as opposed to neck-throughs, because you don't get as much pop and you don't get as much snap. It's more refined as opposed to raw and open. So this is basically a combination of Rickenbacker and the best of Fender. And most basses that are neck-throughs are copies of this concept, which is basically goes back to Rickenbacker. And the bolt-on is still being made because of the same reasons. You can buy them both in 5-string, 4-string nowadays, 6-string combinations. There's a company called Conklin Basses that will make you a 9-string bass. Oh, next about that. No, I'm teasing. It's just more about that wide, but it's a wide neck. There's a couple of gentlemen in the area that play these Conklins, and they go pretty deep down. They go as low as a keyboard would go, and almost as high as, I don't know, maybe with a 9-string, you can only go so low before the frequencies really dissipate out of the human ear range. So maybe it's more upper range, but they also make 9-string guitars and 7 strings and 8 strings. You can get more than what you want nowadays with instruments, but they're all similarly constructed. You're going to get a bolt on, you're going to get a glue on, or you're going to get a neck through, and that's would be the differences. The amount of sustain, least amount of sustain, most attack in the bolt on, most sustain, least amount of attack in the neck through. And last but not least, because of the fact that we now have this kind of technology, we can now play upright. I always wanted to make a ton of, I made myself a ton of fretless basses in the standard bass guitar format, but I never seemed to get the sound I was looking for. And when they came out with these, this was the greatest thing. Except my intonation is a little out today. So this is, again, a Steinberger design, the headless. And we got little dots on the side of the neck. And this was, when you're looking for something to add into your bass collection, this is one of the coolest things. He makes some others. And for the avid bass player, if you're looking for an upright that you can crank out in your amp as loud as you can crank out your electric, there's more than one variable of this. I know this company's not in business anymore, but again, you can see the headless Ned Steinberger with the fine tuners in the back. But Ned Steinberger makes a line of violins and upright basses, electric, that won't feed back, and they're very neatly. The guy's a fabulous engineer. So if you're looking to expand your basses and you want to start going into upright, they're easier to play. They're not the full scale length of the full size upright. If you notice, even with the upright, they would, with big bands, I noticed when I worked with them as a guitarist, well, actually, I started as the electric bass player, and I kept on telling them to get an upright player. I didn't have this instrument at the time, and my friends, one happened to be a friend, and they also hired another guy to fill in. And in both cases, these guys didn't carry the full upright. They carried more of a 3/4 or even a half size upright, because the scale length would get shorter and the instrument wouldn't be as big as the full scale upright. So on that note, we're going to say good night and thank you for listening to us. I hope you enjoyed the history of the bass guitar. Any questions, feel free to get a hold of Matt and the rest of the gang at Actors Access Cable through Not For Nothing on our little email, or if you feel like liking us on Facebook, feel free to like us on Facebook. Thank you so much, and on behalf of Matt Cogswell, who is also going to thank you very much for watching tonight.